If you look at almost any successful organization in any sector of the world, whether it's corporations that are trying to make money, whether it's the legal profession that's doing the litigation piece, whether it's the healthcare industry and trying to help people in a hospital, all of them have some sort of planning process that they undertake. Just a simple framework. And the important thing is to remember that you can have a very simple framework, but the key is to have a process that's repeatable and it's predictable so that everyone in an organization actually knows what that process is and can contribute to it. Because the true strength of having a fully promulgated planning process is bringing in everyone in the organization and leveraging all of the intellectual abilities of the team and not just a few people that have been anointed as, say, a planner. Most militaries use some sort of saying that goes along these lines. The best plan never survives first contact with the enemy. In the humanitarian space, you could say the best humanitarian plan never survives first contact with a disaster or a humanitarian crisis. But it's a true statement. The real magic of planning is that it's not about the plan. It's about the planners, the people, understanding the environment they're operating in, and then being able to constantly adjust the plan. There's a great quote from Winston Churchill, and actually it's been used by several other military commanders over the course of many years. The plan means nothing. Planning is everything. And what does that mean? It's the minute that you create the plan and you promulgate it, whether it's a fancy PowerPoint slideshow or whether it's something that you wrote down on paper, whether it's a humanitarian snapshot or dashboard that shows what's going on, that's immediately irrelevant because it's the constant planning that continues to adjust the actions and activities you take that's the real magic. It's the people that understand the context and are able to apply changes to future actions. That's where you make your money from using a planning process. Planning, without a doubt, can benefit any organization in the humanitarian sector, whether you're a small organization and you elect to take on a very simple framework for a small group of people that will undertake any type of planning activity, be it financial, be it operational response, moving food, moving aid, evacuating people, doesn't matter. Or you're a large organization and you have a more sophisticated planning cycle that you develop. The reason being is if you think about anything you do in life, the more effectively you plan as an individual, ultimately the better your result typically is. Whether you're going to go on a vacation somewhere, you're doing anything at work related to your job, the more time you put in thinking about your actions before you take them, typically the better the outcome is. Most international militaries in the world have a promulgated formal planning process. You can find a pretty broad range of actual steps in the planning process, but they typically run between 5 and 7 steps. Just to give you an example of what that might look like, the first step is almost always some sort of analysis that's done on the environment you're going to be operating in. The second step is, once the analysis is complete, is actually developing options. You'll often hear militaries refer to those as courses of action, COAs as the acronym. Once you have courses of action developed, we do typically a step called wargaming. Wargaming is thinking about an action you're going to take and what the adversary or the environment's reaction might be to those actions. That's very helpful in deciding if an action you're going to take is going to be effective and if that action is going to be efficient. The next step in the process would be taking the recommended course of action to a commander who's in charge of an organization, having he or she take a look at all the work you've done and actually make a decision on what actions you're going to ultimately take. And then last but not least, putting it into a written order that you can hand out to a large organization of hundreds or thousands or even 10,000s of people that they will go execute out in the field. The term wargaming, which is one of the critical steps in almost every planning process international militaries use, it may not sound like it fits well in the humanitarian sector. But in fact it does. It actually is critically important in the humanitarian space. So you can take away the term war and just call it gaming if you want. Another term that's often used is a red cell. So the red cell meaning it's an adversary. I like to think of any humanitarian crisis is the adversary is actually the aftermath of a crisis. So it's people suffering, potentially people getting killed, people starving, needing some sort of aid. So in the humanitarian context, thinking about any action that you're going to take as an organization, whether it's in the development space or actually in the humanitarian response space for a disaster. Every action is going to have some sort of reaction, whether it's from a person or from the environment. So just spending any time at all, whether it's a few minutes, a few hours, or even a few days, if you've got the time, to think about the implications of each specific action your organization would be undertaking, it might allow you to refine and become more effective and more efficient in how you plan and ultimately execute your humanitarian operation. The needs assessment is the critical first step of any formal planning process, but it doesn't end there. To do analysis at the very beginning when you initiate a formal planning process to respond to any type of complex emergency or natural disaster, you need to have a basic understanding of what the needs are. Is it water? Is it food? Is it shelter? Is it security? But as you start to build an understanding, and as you work through the steps of a formal planning process to ultimately decide what actions you're going to take, it's really important to continue that assessment. And it's an ongoing iterative process that feeds the entire decision-making process. So the planning process never really ends. You continue to execute and refine the decisions that you've made each day and sometimes even each hour of a humanitarian operation. During that response, getting that updated assessment and allowing that to improve how you're using your resources, which are often very limited resources. Limited people, limited finance, limited supplies. The needs assessment is possibly the most important point to do, and often the part that's ignored because early on, there's a lack of general understanding of what is needed. I think the information communication technology arena and some of the remote sensing work that's being done, all these innovations in the humanitarian space, are going to allow us to be better planners in the humanitarian sector moving forward, because we are going to have more information. We're going to have more accurate information. The only issue is we might have information overload. Big data is definitely changing the way humanitarian responses are being conducted. It could, if we institute a formal planning process where applicable and where appropriate, it might allow us to ultimately all become better at providing coordinated responses across many different stakeholders. If you look at a large organization, say the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, when they have a humanitarian response that necessitates more than one agency within the UN, that they're going to be helping them manage that response with other organizations, they will typically undertake the humanitarian program cycle, which is a simple framework to understand, 5 steps, but it essentially allows them to do exactly what militaries would do, which is analyze the problem, think about how they're going to mobilize their resources in response to that problem, and most importantly, really share information across multiple stakeholders and coordinate effectively with many other organizations and actors that are going to be operating in that same environment, doing many different things, all towards one common objective, which is helping people that have been impacted by some sort of emergency. So you can look at the humanitarian program cycle, and typically the output of that is a UN humanitarian response plan. And it's going to have very high-level strategic objectives and activities that come out of that. And then that higher-level humanitarian response plan is typically broken down into 2 things: a country strategy for the country that's been impacted, and then a cluster plan for each of the clusters that's actually been activated to respond. So you can look, no matter how big your humanitarian organization is, if you're operating in that country where UN OCHA has operated and has executed that humanitarian program cycle, you could take a look at their higher level strategic objectives and the activities that they plan on undertaking. That'll allow you within that particular cluster then to look at the specific things that will focus on, say, nutrition or shelter or wash. And you can align yourself not only with the UN, but optimally with the other organizations that are going to be operating in the same environment as you. An excellent opportunity for an organization is to take a look at an existing response that has already been executed and to go back and try to take a retrospective look and start at the beginning by looking at the information you had at the start of that crisis, and then work through the planning process and war game it based on the knowledge you had at the very beginning.